Hello, my name is Ben James, and the title of my paper today is Gilded Cages, Nuns' Cells in Early Modern Lisbon. In 1703, João Correia de la Cerda delayed the entrance of his daughters into the Mosteiro de Nossa Senhora da Encarnação in Lisbon, in order that there be time for the rooms to be freshly decorated for them. Walls were freshly whitewashed, and woodworkers and gilders were engaged to further decorate the spaces. Furniture, utensils, and soft furnishings were ordered and delivered so that these girls would have everything that they could possibly need before taking up residence. Not quite the austere cell that the monastic constitutions intended. Female convents were homes for generations of women across the Roman Catholic world. Beyond the grilles and curtains, up tiled staircases and along corridors lined with oratories, these convents provided places of residence, retreat, and education, whether temporarily or perpetually. This paper focuses on the convents of early modern Lisbon, and the period of analysis stretches from 1640 to 1750. During this period, there were 28 convents within and around the city of Lisbon that housed a mixture of professed, non-professed, hired, and sometimes enslaved women. The existing historiography on convents and nuns has dispelled the assumption that all nuns lived in Spartan cells, despite each monastic constitution calling for them to shine with holy poverty. In Lisbon, the convents were dominated by elite women who used the city's convents as schools, as homes, and as spaces for socializing. In this paper, I hope to demonstrate the correlation between nun cells and elite households, both in the relationship to space, but also the wealth that they contained. This paper will therefore focus more on the experience of elite women. Early modern Lisbon was a highly diverse city and a centre of international trade. There were communities of several European polities, as well as a large population of enslaved, freed, and free peoples. Housing in the city was, as in the case of many comparable cities of the era, cramped, and many buildings were separated into different apartments with shops or artisans' workspaces beneath. In elite households, there wasn't necessarily an upstairs-downstairs divide between the family and their servants, but there was the practice of men and women living in separate quarters. Elite men and women were expected to live, eat, pray, and be educated separately. This can be seen in the way that elite noble and royal homes were arranged, specifically with separate apartments for the ladies of the house. As you can see in the floor plan on the screen, there are a suite of rooms on the right-hand side from letters E to H that were reserved for the women of this Lisbon home. An alcove, labelled I on the image, is where the lady of the house slept, deep within the house and away from windows and doors. In the court society, Norbert Elias observes that the home was the physical representation not just of the social hierarchy, but also of the different roles, responsibilities, and commitments of the aristocracy. Elias notes that in the private apartments of the houses of the French nobility, there was more privacy in rooms set aside for the lady of the house. The crucial point is not that there was privacy, but that there was more privacy, and Elias presents domestic spaces as a gradation of privacy, where privacy pertains to levels of interpersonal intimacy. As Mark Wigley writes in The Housing of Gender, the house is literally understood as a mechanism for the domestication of women. The primary source for his analysis is Leon Battista Alberti's I Libri della Famiglia, in which the author encourages the separation of men and women. The husband and wife must have separate bedrooms, not only to ensure that the husband be not disturbed by his wife when she is about to give birth or is ill, but also to allow them, even in summer, an uninterrupted night's sleep whenever they wish. Alberti's writings echo classical writing, and so the separation of men from women, and in particular the sequestration of elite women within the home, had pre-Christian roots. The social and cultural appeal of convents in Lisbon as single-sex spaces for elite women can therefore be understood through a domestic lens, the need or desire for single-sex spaces where women might live, be educated, and socialized. By the early modern period, all female convents were expected to practice strict enclosure. This relationship between the monastic estate for women and space had been defined in the 13th century. In 1298, Pope Boniface VIII issued a papal decretal beginning Pericoloso, in which it was stated, "We do firmly decree by this present constitution, which shall forever remain in force, that nuns collectively and individually, both at present and in future, ought henceforth to remain perpetually cloistered in their monasteries," and so on and so forth. The monastic estate for women, therefore, would become increasingly defined along a spatial axis. Women religious were to live removed from the world, separated not simply by their monastic profession, but physically with walls, locked doors, grills, and curtains. Pericoloso was upheld in later centuries at the Council of Trent, rather bluntly, and this relationship with space was a source of perennial concern and anxiety for numerous societies and in numerous locations. How enclosure was enforced, how it was accepted or resisted, has been the source of fascinating scholarship, and I would signpost people to Alison Weber and her work on St. Teresa de Avila, and Craig A. Monson's analysis of convent music in Bologna. For elite Portuguese women, this enclosure mirrored the expectations of sex segregation that existed within the broader society. Even in the large houses of merchants and the palaces of the royal noble families, rooms were often shared with servants or relatives. Elite women did not simply set up homes within convent walls, but formed households of their own. Professed and lay women shared rooms and apartments within convents. There was a mixing of older and younger women, girls learning at the knee of a sister, a cousin, or grandmother. These rooms might also house subordinated women, either distantly related, hired, or enslaved. For example, in 1697, Dona Maria Pimenta da Silva and her husband, Nuno Barreto, had founded a conceptionist institution called the Convento de Nossa Senhora de Conceição de Luz. Following her widowhood, Dona Maria Pimenta retired to her convent into a room that she had built next to the abbess's own quarters. But she did not go alone. Dona Maria Pimenta was accompanied by two illegitimate daughters of her brother-in-law, who were to be educated at the convent and then to profess as choir nuns. She also paid for the entrance of two leigas, lay sisters, who were described as her two servants. Dona Maria Pimenta had not only created a physical home within the convent, but had also created her own household, a household that she was supporting from her own pocket. Dona Maria Pimenta's independent wealth had allowed her to do this, and this is a factor that is quite striking within the Portuguese case. Women and girls had always been actively included within the Portuguese system of inheritance. This system was partable and cognatic. In other words, daughters inherited along with their siblings from their fathers and mothers. Indeed, married women's wealth was not subsumed into their husbands. In fact, it was illegal for husbands to spend, take, or otherwise alienate their wives' wealth. These rights had been codified into law in the 15th century. When girls or women were entering convents, a negotiation over inheritance had to take place. Unlike in France, a civil death did not occur due to the act of monastic profession. In some cases, therefore, Portuguese nuns renounced their claims to inheritance through a legal contract called a renuncia, literally renunciation. Through such a contract, an individual renounced their rights and claims to an office or an inheritance in favor of someone else and in return for an income or stipend. In 1742, at the Convento do Santíssimo Sacramento, Soroa Madalena do Rosário, daughter of the Viscondessa de Vila Nova de Silveira, renounced her paternal and maternal inheritances in favor of her brother. In return, she would receive 40,000 reis a year, but the contract also stipulated that a failure to pay would lead her portion of the inheritance to be claimed by the convent. Portuguese nuns did not enter with an expectation of living in absolute monastic poverty, but rather a modified, conditional, and often contractual poverty. In this way, they were able to set up households within the convent. Whilst this example appears very cash-centric, much of the wealth that nuns brought into the convent came as cloth, as silverware, as gold, as hardwood furniture, or even as silk covers and curtains. Nuns used their individual wealth and their material wealth that they brought with them to fashion their living quarters into rooms that were in line with the cultural norms and interiors common to their natal homes or palaces. The Mosteiro de São Denis de Odivelas is one of the best known, or infamous, convents within Portugal, its name almost synonymous with excess. When Cosimo de' Medici, future Grand Duke of Tuscany, visited the nuns here, his secretary recorded that the women appeared in white habits, corsets and petticoats, as well as gloves with ribbons around their wrists, which they adorn with bracelets and are solid with jewels. The most well-known nun from this convent was Madre Paula de Odivelas, the cloistered lover of the king, Dom João V, and who was meant to have occupied a sumptuously decorated suite of rooms that are allegedly described in a manuscript held at the Biblioteca Nacional de Lisboa. Very little of this document can actually be substantiated. However, I want to remain with the example of Odivelas and present the case of Dona Inês de Lima, who entered the convent in about 1670, aged 15 or 16. Dona Inês wrote a letter to her father in which she declared all the things that she had taken from his house. The letter and her writing is present on the screen at the moment. It is an informal but illuminating inventory that helps illustrate what a nun's room might look like or what it might contain. For furniture, Dona Inês took a bed, sideboards, an unspecified number, and 2 desks with short legs. The silverware she took included a spittoon, a chamber pot, a bowl, a plate, 4 candlesticks, 5 spoons, 5 knives, and 3 forks. The soft furnishing that she notes were 2 tablecloths, 2 cloths for the sideboards, 1 velvet blanket, 1 bed cover, 3 white quilts, 1 carpet, and a coverlet of old blue satin for the bed. In addition to these items, she also took several devotional objects, 2 rosaries, an unspecified religious image, 1 ivory Christ on a gilded cross that came from India, and another smaller Christ, also in ivory. Dona Inês was able to arrange her own living quarters as she saw fit, and her choice to bring expensive materials such as gold and silk into the convent were not considered at odds with the vow of poverty that she would ultimately profess. I hope that I've been able to demonstrate a correlation between the way in which domestic and convent spaces were understood and used. There are even examples within Lisbon of palaces that abutted convents, allowing the women of the house to make use of the convent church from private balconies, mimicking how their cloistered neighbours attended services. One such was the Palace of Conde de Redondo, which at one point housed the Dowager Queen of England, Catherine of Braganza, when she returned to Lisbon during her widowhood. Sex segregation was a monastic ideal that chimed with the cultural and social expectations placed on elite women in Lisbon. Many elite girls and women would spend part or all of their lives within a convent. They did not enter these institutions as individuals, but joined networks of relatives or even entered at the same time as numerous sisters. The homes that nuns created within convents had more in common with their natal homes than the constitutional ideal of the cell that shone with holy poverty. Many thanks, and thank you for listening.